All right, everybody, how are y'all today? Well, welcome to our Bible study today, and we're glad to have you in this room, and we want to welcome those of you that are online today who are joining us for this time, and we are rapidly making our way through this season. This coming Sunday is Palm Sunday. It's hard to believe that that's where we are. Of course, Easter's a little early this year. It's about the earliest it can ever be, actually. So, but we're really looking forward to our celebration that we're going to have. So with that said, we are in Exodus 8 today. So if you've got your copy of the Old Testament, that's where I want us to go. I'm still referring to all of these plagues as God's miraculous demonstration of power. And so let me just remind you, you can see on your outline, these signs, these plagues, when you're reading the story in the book of Exodus, sometimes the word that's used is referred to as a sign. Sometimes the word that's used is referred to as what we would translate as a plague. And we actually will see that word today in this particular chapter. And God is in the process of delivering his people, but he's going to do it his way, according to his timetable, and he's going to accomplish what he wants to accomplish before Israel actually is able to leave Egypt, okay? So with that said, let's just look at this text, okay? So at the end of chapter 7, we've got the Nile turn into blood, remember? And so chapter 7, verse 25 says, 7 days passed after the Lord struck the Nile. Then, chapter 8, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, this is what the Lord says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs on your whole country. The Nile will teem with frogs. They will come up into your palace, into your bedroom, onto your bed, into the houses of your officials, on your people, into your ovens and kneading troughs. The frogs will come up on you and your people and all your officials. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over streams and canals and ponds and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt. So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land. But the magicians did the same thing by their secret arts. They also made frogs come up on the land of Egypt. So Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord. Moses said to Pharaoh, I leave to you the honor of setting the time for me to pray for you and your officials and your people, so that you and your houses may be rid of the frogs, except for those that remain in the Nile. Tomorrow, Pharaoh said. Moses replied, it will be as you say, so that you may know that there's no one like the Lord our God. The frogs will leave you and your houses, your officials, and your people, and they will remain only in the Nile. After Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh, Moses cried out to the Lord about the frogs he had brought on Pharaoh. And the Lord did what Moses asked. The frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards, and in the fields. They were piled into heaps, and the land reeked of them. But when Pharaoh saw there was relief, he hardened his heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. So, when I came here to the lectern today, somebody had placed a little frog. So I'm not sure who did that, but I had asked Warren to cook frog legs for y'all today, but I see that he chose a different option. Is that right? And yeah, he's chosen actually my favorite today, right? And actually not, in case you don't know that about me. He's making me a club sandwich and french fries. How about that? So, but y'all go ahead and eat whatever it is you're eating. It's all good. Well, we begin the journey today with this similar demand from God, where God says to Pharaoh, through Moses and Aaron, let my people go so they can come worship me. And so that is the continuing plan of God. That is going to be the plea that Moses and Aaron will share with Pharaoh for these several months. Remember, we talked last time, this is probably about just based upon the way that the story is told, probably about 8 months or so, somewhere in that neighborhood, to kind of account for all the different factors that we're able to account for as the story is told. So, but we do know this, when the Nile was turned to blood. It only occurred for a week, and now this second expression of God's power takes place, and that's the plague of frogs. So God threatens Pharaoh with the plague of frogs. I want you to look at verse 2. This is one of the times when that actual word, nagaf, is actually used in the text. And what it means is to strike a blow. It means to exert power in a very forceful way. You can translate it with the word plague. That's been kind of the modern translation of that Hebrew word. So basically what God says is, I'm going to strike a blow to the land of Egypt. And this time it's going to be frogs. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Frogs. They seem pretty harmless. But if you've read or researched much about Egyptian worldview and their understanding of their pantheon of gods, frogs were actually sacred in Egypt. The Egyptians were forbidden to kill frogs. And they had to deal with frogs because when the Nile overflowed, sometimes, if I remember correctly, sometimes in the fall of the year, around September or so, parts of the area around the Nile River would be overrun with frogs as they emerged from the Nile River. So these people are accustomed to seeing lots of frogs and hearing lots of frogs at a certain time of the year. As you might imagine, that's led some scholars to say, well, God must have just taken advantage of that with this particular miracle, if you will. But regardless, they were sacred. They were accustomed to seeing frogs, having to deal with frogs. What they weren't accustomed to was just how many there were. But here's what's fascinating about their view of frogs. The Egyptian goddess Heket, sometimes it's spelled very different ways, she was the goddess of fertility. And there was this idea that she was actually married to one of the gods of the Egyptians. And she was especially blessed with the ability to bear children. And so she was called upon by the Egyptian women when they were in the middle of childbirth. They would call upon her. They would actually have images of frogs brought into their homes because they believed that somehow the frog, and maybe there might even be indications they might even have brought real frogs in. We don't know that for sure. But we find expressions and images of this god in the tombs of the Egyptians. We find her image all over, and she has the head of a frog, and they believed that she had special power, and so the frogs had special power. They were symbols of fertility. So if you had a lot of them at a certain time show up, that was a good sign that your wife, or if you were the woman, that you were going to be able to have children. I think it's interesting that the very first two plagues, the first miracle that God performs was more of a sign. Remember when the rod turns into a snake? That was really more of a sign. It wasn't really a plague per se. But the Nile turning to blood was a plague. And for 7 days, the Egyptians had to live with their fears about were they going to have adequate water to drink? Was the Nile killing all the fish? Or whatever. Well, isn't it fascinating that first plague is God turning the Nile to blood, and we already have the knowledge that the Nile River was a place of death for Hebrew boys when Moses was born. And so God takes that very instrument of death, if you will, and strikes it, right? So I don't think it's accidental that that's what happened. Then the next plague has to do with fertility and bearing children. And if you remember, Pharaoh chose the Hebrew midwives to be the instruments of death. Remember? So when a woman was calling on help, a Jewish woman was calling on a midwife to help her have a baby, that midwife was supposed to take that baby and if it was a boy, throw him into the Nile River. So the midwife actually became an instrument of death. So the very people that the Hebrew women were calling upon to help them in childbirth, Pharaoh was challenging them to be instruments and agents of death. And isn't it interesting that the second plague is inflicted upon frogs, which were called upon, kind of like midwives, if you will, to assist Egyptian women to have children. Does that make sense? So none of this is accidental, is what I'm saying. God is doing something very specific, okay? He has watched the Nile River cry out to him with the blood of Hebrew boys. He also has seen what these Hebrew midwives, or at least were purportedly forced to do. Now, y'all remember in the very first page of Exodus, we're told some of the Hebrew women wouldn't do it, remember? And the midwife said, man, we're sorry we get there, and these women, they're hardy women. They've already had the babies by the time we get there, and they're already taking care of everything. Interesting. But point is, the very first two plagues strike at the heart of Egypt in both of those areas, the Nile River and in the idea of fertility and the birth of children. And so then what's interesting is the plague, it's almost humorous, so to speak, when you just read what happened. When you look at verse 3, like I said, they're accustomed to frogs coming up out of the Nile. That happened every year. What they weren't accustomed to was what's described after that. They come into your palace, into your bedroom, onto your bed, into the houses of your officials, into your ovens, and in your kneading troughs. In other words, everybody is just overrun with frogs in their everyday life. So they're cooking food, they're getting ready to go to bed, and the problem is they can't kill them because they're sacred. So you just have to deal with them. So you can imagine these Hebrew women saying, honey, come get these frogs out of, pick something, wherever they all were. I don't know, maybe the little boys thought it was kind of cool to have so many frogs. I'm not sure if your grandsons or sons played with frogs when they were little. But the point is, even Pharaoh's house, their palaces, everybody is overrun. You know, when the Nile River turns to blood, we're not sure how that affected Pharaoh per se. Pharaoh's accustomed to people bringing him things. Now, he did go down to the Nile as some type of a ritual, evidently. But now it's affected him. His house is overrun with frogs. And so I'm not sure how Mrs. Pharaoh, or how many Mrs. Pharaohs there were, had much to say about this. So it's almost humorous, really, when you think about it. It's just debilitating and irritating. You know, it wasn't striking their cattle. It wasn't, locusts eating up their crops. It wasn't the angel of death. So we're not in that category. We're just in a nuisance category, right? Just frogs, of all things. And what's fascinating about that is the Hebrew people, their only association with frogs really is in Egypt. You don't have any reference to frogs in Canaan. They don't talk about frogs ever. So this is something that seems to be an Egyptian phenomenon. Once again, what's fascinating is Pharaoh's magicians were able to repeat the plague, but the implication is on a small scale. In other words, they could not do to the level that God had done, but they at least somehow created the illusion that they were bringing more frogs in as well. Which again, I pointed out to y'all last week. It's just funny to me that Pharaoh's magicians just every time make things worse. That's what's weird to me. In other words, if I were Pharaoh and my magicians came to me and said, okay, the Jews' God made all these frogs, the last thing I would want you to do is make more frogs. I mean, we already have frogs, so I would want you to maybe do something else, like get rid of them, But that's not what they could do. They were powerless to do anything about the overwhelming onslaught of frogs. So now, what is Pharaoh's recourse? Okay, he's familiar, like I said, with a certain time of year where there's plenty of frogs to go around. He's also very familiar with the goddess cult of Heket, so he knows all about that. He knows they can't kill frogs. He knows that frogs are sacred to them. So now what? What's he going to do? He's called on his magicians, and all they can do is repeat on a small scale what's happened. So isn't it interesting what Pharaoh does? Look at verse 8. Pharaoh summons Moses and says, would you pray to Yahweh to take away the frogs from me and my people? Isn't that interesting? Now, if you go back to chapter 5, verse 1, Moses and Aaron, they go to visit Pharaoh, and they say, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. Verse 2, Pharaoh says, who is Yahweh? that I should ask him anything. Who is this Lord that you're talking about? Okay. Now we get to a few months later, we're here in chapter 8, and we're in verse 8, and Pharaoh says, would you mind going and praying to Yahweh to fix this? Isn't that interesting? Here's the most powerful man in the country. Many Egyptians would have viewed him as a god. He would carry himself as a god. You know, that eventually became true for the Egyptians. And he realizes he can't do anything about all these frogs, and everybody's frustrated. Now, he's also a little bit of a politician. You know, even though these men were incredible dictators, they still had political aspirations, and they wanted to be in favor with the people. We find that in when you fast forward to the Roman Empire. The Romans were, once they became imperial Rome, you have these Caesars who were incredibly powerful people, but they also had a political bone in their body, so they tried to placate the people. That's why in the Roman Empire you have things like the Colosseum and circuses and all those things, because you were trying to help all these people who had such a challenging life to have something to go to. You know, they could go and watch these chariot races, and they could go and watch these gladiators, and everything was free for the populace. So those were ways to manipulate the populace. There was a political side to all this. Well, I can only imagine the pressure that Pharaoh's under because of all the frogs. You know, everybody wants them gone. Can you do something about it? And Pharaoh's answer is prayer. I love that. Okay? His answer is, would y'all go pray about it? There's got to be a sermon in there somewhere about that, okay? And so Moses says, okay, but I love verse 9. Moses is an act of deference to Pharaoh. Moses says, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will do this, but I'm going to let you, because of the position you have, and this is Moses being deferential, you choose the time, and I'll ask the Lord. And lose y'all? Hello. Okay, I'm back. Pharaoh says tomorrow, which again I find somewhat humorous. Why not today? I don't know. I'm not sure, but it could be that he just wants to see whether or not he can do it or not. That's what I like about it, is the idea that he chose a time, you know, to choose it on this particular day, and Moses says, okay. So I guess one of the things I think about when I'm looking at this story is what's happening inside of Pharaoh. Is there a little bit of a softening that's occurring? The very fact that he would even acknowledge that there was a Lord, you know, that he has to admit he can't do what he would like to do about this. I mean, he's called his magicians in, and, you know, they're still all there, and he asks Moses to pray about it, and then he gives Moses a timeline. I'm not sure how all that exchange played out, but here's what's unmistakable. Now we'll just see what God can do. Now we're going to find out. Can God really do this? And will it be unmistakable? So guess what? God does it. And when God does it, well, now it's clear and unmistakable God can do it. Now, the challenge, though, of what God chose to do, what he could have done, if you think about it, he could have just sent all the frogs back into the Nile River. You know what I mean? He could have done that. But the problem with that, y'all, is that's what the Egyptians were accustomed to. In other words, when they were overrun at some level with the frogs all went back into the river at a certain point. And so that wouldn't have been viewed as a miracle. Okay? Guess what God does? He just strikes them all dead. So now in your kneading trough and in your bedroom and in your oven, you don't just have frogs, you got dead frogs. Okay? So it's almost like Pharaoh had 3 wishes and he picked the wrong one. He didn't quite, could you get rid of the frogs and could you make sure they don't all just die in my bedroom? You know, he didn't quite give enough instruction. But what it does, though, it sends a message unmistakably, this is the hand of God. You know, God just struck them all dead. And so that now is unexplainable, okay? There's no way that the people of Egypt can explain why in the world did all these frogs just die. And they're teeming everywhere. As a matter of fact, the language that's used in verse 5 is similar to the language that's used in the book of Genesis when the Lord says the land is going to be teeming with life, swarming with life. It's the same Hebrew structure. That's the imagery used here. The land's going to be teeming with frogs, swarming with frogs. So it's the hand of God at work. And then God unmistakably intervenes, and when he does, all the frogs die. So now you would assume, you've heard from Pharaoh, if you will do this, then he'll do what? Let everybody go. So look at verse 14. The frogs are piled up into heaps, and the land reeked of them. That almost sounds like an eyewitness account, that let me tell you what I remember about it. It was really bad, okay? But look at verse 15. When Pharaoh saw there was relief, he hardened his own heart, and he wouldn't listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had told them. So we're at a point now in this journey where Pharaoh, even though he's recognized that he needed help, he asked for it, he's still arrogant. He's still in charge, and he is still not willing to give in to this demand, and he's not going to let the people go. And so he does that of his own volition, actually. So let me just say this about what I see going on right now, and we're going to talk about this all the way through the plagues. God is going to redeem Israel, okay? He is. But he's going to defeat this pantheon of Egyptian gods and goddesses first. And really what God is doing, as I watch that play out, it's more than a theological reality. He's actually dismantling the Egyptian worldview, because everything they believe is built upon all these gods and goddesses and how their life is supposed to be ordered. And just like I said, even when you're having a baby, that woman is supposed to call on this frog-like God to intervene and make sure she has a baby that's healthy. I mean, their entire lives are built around these gods and goddesses and how they're supposed to intervene in their lives. And so God is basically dismantling the Egyptian worldview. The reason I believe that is important is because what is Israel's worldview at this point? Israel now has been in Egypt for over 400 years. Not sure how long they've been enslaved, but you can't help but think that their worldview has been shaped and influenced by what they've been seeing living out in front of them, because they've been powerless to deliver themselves. They've been living at the hand of the Egyptians. So I'm not sure how much of this had filtered into their understanding of reality, how this has affected their worldview. We want to believe that they held on to their monotheism and that they were still practicing the things that they had learned from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But there seems to at least be the need for God to demonstrate himself in such a fashion that the Israelites will recognize this worldview is no good. This is false and pagan, and we're not going to subscribe to it. Because as he delivers them, he's giving them a memorable and unforgettable experience of deliverance. This is something they will talk about from now on. This will be what they will teach their children. Remember how God did this? Remember how God did that? And can you imagine, when you're many, many, many years later, because the Jewish moms are teaching their children at home these great stories of the faith. Can you imagine these Jewish moms telling these stories? And I would love to have heard that, telling their little boys and their little girls, well, one time, here's what God did. He sent frogs. And can't you just see the little boys and girls, frogs? Yeah, frogs, like real frogs. And they were everywhere, in their food and in their bed and in their ovens. And I can just see these little Hebrew kids going, that is awesome. In other words, these are unforgettable demonstrations of God's power. And so he is going to give them something that they will carry with them for the rest of their lives and their existence. Even today, just in the Egyptian worldview, this whole idea of deliverance is woven into their psyche, that God's hand of deliverance has been here before. Hopefully it will be in the future. They still lean into that reality. And so God's going to do this in an unforgettable way. Now that leads me to a word about us today. So God's going to comprehensively, holistically act here in Egypt. So what's God doing right now? When you look at our world today, what do you think is going on right now in our world? What do you think God is up to? Do you think God has just taken his hand off the wheel, so to speak, with his creation? Do you think he's just kind of eased back a little bit? Do you think God's ever scratching his head, puzzled, wondering what in the world is going on with humanity? I mean, is that really what we believe about God? I don't think so. What I would tell you and what I believe myself today is, you know what God's doing right now? He is comprehensively, holistically acting because he has a plan in place, just like he had a plan in place for for Israel and Egypt. He has a plan in place for his people today. He has a plan in place for what he is going to accomplish in history, and he's going to do it in his own way, and he's going to do it in an unforgettable manner, and it's going to be way more comprehensive than anything you and I could ever imagine, because that's just how God works. Think about it. The Jews in the first century, they were tired of being ruled by foreigners. They were tired of the Romans enforcing their will on the Jews, particularly in the Holy Land. And so you have these little skirmishes, you have these little small rebellions where the Jews would get all excited about some particular leader. And so there was a sense in which there was this messianic fervor was at a fever pitch in those days. And so when Jesus appears and he starts doing things that nobody could explain, you remember how even Nicodemus, who's a trained man in the Scripture, remember Nicodemus went to see Jesus. You remember what he said to him? He said, "We know you're from God." How did he know? Nobody's ever done these kind of things. I mean, and the implication from Nicodemus is, finally, we've been waiting on you. We've been waiting on somebody to show up who can do these things. Because in Nicodemus's mind, man, this is about to happen. I'm here shepherding the people of God, but I've got the shackles of Rome on me, and all of a sudden I'm sitting across from a guy who doesn't seem to care about any of that. And he just talks differently, and he carries himself differently, and he's performing miracles that we just have never seen before. And I guarantee you, Nicodemus's mind, man, these shackles that I'm experiencing right now, they're about to be broken, because it just may be the Messiah is about to come. Because he had a limited view of what God was doing. In his mind, God was delivering Israel from the Romans. That's what the Messiah was going to do. And so this coming Sunday, when we celebrate Palm Sunday, remember, Jesus doesn't ride into Jerusalem on a white horse. Right? That's not what he did. How did Jesus come into Jerusalem? On a donkey. Okay? A young colt. He doesn't come in, a lot of times we refer to it as the triumphal entry of Jesus. Well, I will embrace that as long as we recognize what kind of triumph we're talking about. Because he's not coming in to bring about that really limited, narrow thing that the Jews were looking for. And I'm not saying this in a way to denigrate the Jewish theology. I'm just telling you that was the prevailing view in those days, though. Well, Jesus is coming to show them that's not why I came. I didn't come to deliver you from Rome. I came to deliver you from yourselves and the forces of evil that you don't even realize are at work. In fact, I came to deliver a comprehensive victory that you've never even imagined. In my kingdom, it's very different than what you're imagining. And so he'd been trying to teach them about it, but the point was God's plan was so much bigger and more comprehensive and more holistic through Jesus than the Jews were expecting. Well, I would tell y'all, I don't know what your view of how things are supposed to go as the world begins to progress and move in the direction that the Lord would have it to move. But what I would say to you is, my view of that is, I believe that God right now is at work more comprehensively, more holistically connected to his plan than any of us could ever really imagine. I think every one of us probably have a limited view of what that's really going to be like. And so that's why it's going to be done on his timetable, because he's going to orchestrate circumstances and make sure that there are some things that are in place so that it is clear and unmistakable that this is his hand. It's not humanity's doing, it's God's doing. And so the Lord, just like he had a plan in action in the days of Israel in Egypt, he has a plan right now, and I believe he's orchestrating that plan, and I trust him. And so when people tell me, things will happen across our world, and they'll say, man, do you think do you think we're approaching the last days? My normal comment to that is, well, we are one day closer to it than we were yesterday. That much I know. Now, how it's all going to play out and when it's all going to play out, I don't know. But I will tell you this, it's going to be unmistakable and clear when it happens, and it will be God's hand, and it'll be done in his way and his time, and I trust him to do it. So, all right, with that said, I'm going to stop. So those of you that have been watching us online, thank you, blessings, and we will see you next week.